Hi, my name is David Warner Matheson, and today I'd like to talk about
Your higher self.
the world's ancient myths. And to explain why this subject is so relevant to our lives, I'd like to start by noting that according to some very informed research, there are approximately 35 million people who are taking psychotropic medications in the United States right now. That means medications designed to affect the mind and the emotions and or the behaviors of an individual. Now, the estimated total population for the entire United States is between 327 million and 329 million as of the end of 2018. So that means that if 35 million are taking psychotropic medications, then more than one person out of every 10 people in the United States is taking these kinds of medications. And a large percentage of that was for, most of them were for either depression or anxiety. Those figures aren't even counting individuals who may have depression or anxiety but aren't taking medication or haven't been prescribed medication for them. So that's a huge number of people, a very high percentage. Renowned physician and author Gabor Mate explains that the root cause of anxiety and depression stems from a separation from our authentic self, resulting from trauma. Note that he himself does not argue against use of medication to treat these problems, but he does argue that whether or not medication is appropriate, it's vitally important to address the separation from the self, which lies at the root of serious conditions such as anxiety and depression and addiction, and which that same separation can also lead to serious physical repercussions. It can express itself in different types of chronic disease, of a physical nature. When I first discovered Dr. Mate's work, I became very excited because for the past 10 years, I've been examining the world's ancient myths, and I'm convinced that one of the central themes and central purposes of the ancient myths and scriptures and sacred stories which were given to every culture on our planet has to do with a reintegration with the authentic self, often pictured in the myths as the higher self or the divine self or as the hidden God who must be found again. In this video, I will share just a few thoughts about reconnecting with yourself that I've found in the myths. There's obviously more to the subject than this, but I'll share a few thoughts here in the hope that they might be helpful to you. As always, I strongly suggest that you go to the myths themselves rather than listen to someone else's advice or opinion, including my own. Nobody else can reconnect with yourself for you. Only you can do it. And this leads to the first important point, and that is that reconnecting with yourself is not achieved through anything or anyone outside of you. There's nothing external that you can chase, nothing external that you can achieve that will, once achieved or reached, recover your authentic self. This is one of the reasons that I believe it's so important to realize that the world's ancient myths and scriptures are based on the stars, using a system of celestial metaphor, including all the stories and figures in the biblical scriptures. The fact that these myths can be shown to be metaphorical in their fundamental nature indicates that they're not about external characters or events that are outside of you. That's why I agree so strongly with Alvin Boyd Kuhn that they're 1,000 times more precious as myths than as supposed terrestrial history, because that would mean they're about external characters. They're actually metaphorical. They're not about external characters or events that are outside of you. In fact, some rather well-known biblical scriptures even declare very directly that you already have access to what you're seeking and searching for, and that it's not external to you at all. In verses such as Luke 17:21, which declares, "Neither shall they say, 'Lo, here,' or 'Lo, there.' For behold, the kingdom of God is within you." So before discussing how we might reconnect with our authentic self, maybe we should try to realize what it is. And I think it might be easiest to try and do that by understanding what it is not. We're all actually pretty familiar with what it is not. That's the part of us that is full of doubts and misconceptions and anxieties and erroneous assumptions that trip us up. The New Testament scriptures actually give us a very good picture of this familiar aspect of ourselves, this doubting aspect of ourselves, in the person of doubting Thomas. There's an episode in the Gospel according to John, chapter 20, in which Thomas is described, and we're told that Thomas is called Didymus, which is a Greek word which means the twin. In that chapter, Thomas encounters the risen Jesus, who invites Thomas to feel his hands and his side, after which Thomas declares, "My Lord and my God." Thomas is a perfect figure of our egoic mind, which has developed all kinds of defense mechanisms in order to negotiate this life, and which has learned various lessons through experience, and then which has formulated all these rules and thought structures and uses those past experiences to evaluate what's going on and to decide what to do and what to say. We all have a doubting self, akin to doubting Thomas. Just add your name at the end instead of Thomas. Just add your name instead of that of Thomas. And we operate like doubting Thomas most of the time, I would argue, because we've formulated all these rules and lessons and assumptions as part of being taught how to operate within society. And we use these rules that we've created for ourselves to steer around and to get what we want and to get where we're trying to go. But note that doubts are really based on our mind either projecting itself forward into the future or backwards into the past. That's where those doubts, or the rules and the assumptions that are underlying those doubts, those assumptions that we formed that lead to the doubts, come from either the past or some imaginary future. When our mind is flashing forward into the imagined future or reaching back into the remembered past, our mind is not exactly present. I would argue that this gives us one of the first major clues regarding the identity of the self, the recovery of the authentic self. Those doubts and assumptions and rules are what are alienating us, what did alienate us from our authentic self, our higher self in the first place. In the story of doubting Thomas, they're what are alienating Thomas from the figure of Jesus. Now, remember, we're told very specifically that Thomas is called Didymus, which means the twin. And twins are found throughout the myths of the world, all around the world. Castor and Pollux in the myths of the ancient Greeks, or the hero twins in the myths of the ancient Maya, or the figures of Gilgamesh and Enkidu in the myths of ancient Mesopotamia. And I would argue that these twins are not actually two different persons. They are an illustration of our own divided nature, our alienation from ourself, and our need to recover a part of ourselves from whom we've been alienated or separated. That's what the reconciliation of Thomas and the risen Christ is illustrating for us in the John 20 story. Who is Thomas's twin in this story? It's actually Jesus. He's the higher self, or the divine self, with whom Thomas needs to be reconciled. Notice that we don't see the doubting self eliminated or kicked out in this story. We see the doubting self reconciled. It's actually an important part of who we are, an important aspect of who we are. It's only a part. It's only one aspect of our self to be able to cast our mind forward into the future or backwards into the past in order to learn lessons and even in order to have doubts. But this doubting Thomas part of ourselves needs to be brought into reconciliation with our higher self, which is what you see happening in the Doubting Thomas episode, in which Thomas says, "My Lord and my God." The Doubting Thomas part of who we are is usually where we stay. We let it have control over everything. It's not saying my Lord and my God to anyone or anything. It's our egoic mind says, "Hey, I'm saving you from yourself. I'm the only one who's getting us through all this stuff." This doubting Thomas aspect of our mind, this part of our mind, that's usually where we're operating out of. And when we do that, then we're disconnected from a much bigger part of who we are. Therefore, I would suggest that if our egoic self, that Thomas self, is characterized by assumptions and doubts and lessons and frameworks within which it operates, because that's basically how it was constructed over time. It operates based on these past rules and assumptions and past lessons that it's learned. And those doubts and assumptions come from the mind remembering back to the past or projecting forward to an imagined future. Then our path towards recovering our authentic self lies through the present, becoming present, detaching from the past and the future. And that is the path to getting to our authentic self. I'm not saying that we get rid of our ability to project into the future or learn from the past. We don't see Jesus casting Thomas out or causing Thomas to disappear. But I would suggest that virtually all of our outbursts of anger, our self-sabotage, our addictive patterns are a result of letting our Thomas mind be in control, operating out of these mistaken lessons or pictures of who we are and what is not possible, just like we see Thomas doing, and borrowing frustration or trouble from an imaginary future. And that's what doubts are. And I would suggest that when our Thomas mind starts running away with us or throwing us into these self-sabotaging patterns, the path to putting it in its place involves going right to the present moment, because that's where we can connect with our higher self, our authentic self, and even with the wider realm, the divine realm that's described in the myths. When our mind is running into the future or the past, we're actually running away from our authentic self. We're saying we don't want to be with our own self. If you're driving with someone, for example, and you get stuck in a big traffic jam, or a big slow truck pulls out right in front of you and slows you down, you can react in a couple different ways. You could start cursing and swearing because you're stuck in the car for longer than you planned, and you're thinking about the thing that you need to get to, or the event that you're going to that now you're going to be late for maybe. Or you could say, I don't care if we're in this traffic because it gives me the chance to spend more time with you. Let's say you're driving with a loved one and you get stuck in a traffic jam. If you start cursing and swearing, they're going to start thinking, "Oh, he really or she really doesn't want to spend any time with me. He wants to get out of the car as quickly as possible." Or you could say, "You know what? I don't care that we're in this traffic jam together. It just gives us more time to spend together. Well, when I would suggest that when you're letting your mind rush ahead into the future or constantly rushing back into the past, it's like saying to your own self that you don't really want to spend time together. You're in a hurry to be anywhere else but in the present. But when you stay in the present, it's like you actually always have your higher self in the car with you, so to speak, whether you're with someone or not. And so when you stay in the present, you're opening up to communication with your higher self and with what it's actually trying to tell you, what it knows, what it's perceiving at that exact present moment, which you won't hear if your mind is rushing off somewhere else. Indeed, the metaphor of having your higher self in the car is explicitly depicted in the Bhagavad Gita, in which Arjun plays the role of doubting Thomas, and Krishna is the divine charioteer who tells Arjun to act in the present moment without attachment to imagined outcomes, either good or bad. That's the message of the Bhagavad Gita over and over. Krishna, the Lord Krishna, the God Krishna, is telling Arjun over and over to do what's right now in this moment without attachment to the imagined outcome. It's as if the myths are showing us that we have an egoic self and then we have a divine or a higher self. And the question is, which one do we want driving the chariot? When we operate out of our doubting Thomas mind or our doubting Arjun mind, we tend to sabotage ourselves. And the myths illustrate this over and over. For example, in the wonderful Norse myth about Thor and Loki visiting the kingdom of a powerful Jotun named Utgarda Loki, who's a master of illusion and who basically tricks Thor and his companions into thinking that they've lost every single contest over and over, when in fact, if they weren't operating out of mistaken assumptions and misperceptions, they would have easily defeated Utgarda Loki and his fellow Jotuns. Another illustration, which I find very powerful, is the text of the Odyssey, Book 5. I've talked about this in a few other videos, and I think it's really powerful. When Odysseus is stranded out in the sea, he's swimming for 3 days in the open ocean, and he finally spots land. But the first spot where he tries to make shore is an inhospitable, rocky shoreline with towering cliffs and jagged rocks, and the powerful waves are crashing against those rocks, threatening to dash him to pieces. And the text of the poem actually shows us his internal monologue. It shows us the thoughts of Odysseus, and we can see his doubting mind, his doubting Thomas mind, if you will, or his doubting Odysseus mind, start to run away with him. In the Robert Fagles translation, the wonderful Robert Fagles translation of the Odyssey, in Book 5, starting in line 450, we see this inner dialogue of Odysseus talking to himself. I'll start quoting now. Here's Odysseus, quote, "Worse and worse, now that Zeus has granted a glimpse of land beyond my hopes. Now I've crossed this waste of water, the end in sight. There's no way out of the boiling surf. I see no way. Rugged reefs offshore, around them breakers roaring, above them a smooth rock face, rising steeply. Look, in the surge, too deep inshore, no spot to stand on my own 2 legs and battle free of death. If I clamber out, some big comber will hoist me, dash me against that cliff, my struggles all a waste. If I keep on swimming down the coast, trying to find a sea beach, shelving against the wave, a sheltered cove, I dread it. Another gale will snatch me up and haul me back to the fish-infested sea, retching in despair. Or a dark power will loose some monster at me, rearing out of the waves, one of the thousands Amphitrite's breakers teem with them. Well I know the famous god of earthquakes hates my very name." End quote. Well, with thoughts like these, Odysseus would have perished for sure. In fact, the text tells us in the very next line that he would have perished right then and there if the goddess Athena had not inspired him. This episode, as well as the other two that I've cited with doubting Thomas and Jesus, or doubting Arjun and the Lord Krishna, actually show that we usually need help from a higher power in order to overcome the grip of the egoic mind and its self-defeating assumptions and doubts. But when I say that, I'm not contradicting what I said earlier about, I don't want to contradict what I said earlier about not needing to reach for something external. I would argue that the connection to the realm of the gods that we see in the Odyssey or in the ancient myths is internal. The myths show the gods acting through men and women. Indeed, in that passage from the Odyssey, as I've pointed out before, it doesn't say that Athena picks Odysseus up or transports him to shore. It says that Athena inspires him. I would argue that when we open up that connection to our higher self, and indeed to the inspiration and help from the divine realm, that's when we open up to this wider assistance, this divine help, if you will. And we do that by detaching, as Krishna tells Arjun, from that egoic casting forward into the imagined future, or falling back into the often mistaken lessons from the past. And then when we detach, we can come to the very present. And I believe that we have been given a variety of disciplines which can help us to become more and more focused on the present, and putting that doubting Thomas or the doubting Arjun mind into the proper relationship with the divine charioteer, including disciplines, ancient disciplines like meditation or Tai Chi or yoga or tantra or other martial arts or chanting. And there's also a number of activities that we can practice that really require us to be present in the present moment, including playing music or surfing or rock climbing or doing just about any sport really, or doing artwork such as drawing or painting or sculpting. They really reward and punish. They reward being present, and they kind of show you when you're not present. If you're trying to take off on a big wave, you want to be in the present, not thinking about what someone else is thinking of what you're doing or what you just did on the last one. So I believe that these kinds of activities can really help us to recover our connection to ourself. That's why people get into martial arts and they feel like they're rediscovering their self or reconnecting with their self, or some of these other activities like art or going out into nature and being present. And it's because they can help us to be present in the present moment, and then that helps us connect to our authentic self. But notice these, I called them disciplines. You don't just get to that stage on day one, the first day you try and go surfing, or the first day that you try and do sculpture. So I'd like to close this video by pointing out just one other lesson from the myths that we see in the myths that I believe is related to this quest to recover our authentic self. And that's this frequent theme found in various myths and scriptures around the world, advising us to bless and not curse. We see this theme mentioned again and again in both the Old and New Testaments, so-called, of the Bible, for example. For instance, in the story of Balaam and the ass, which once again can be shown to be based on the stars. I've done some videos and blog posts writing about that. And it's celestial metaphor. It's not historical event. And in that story, we see Balaam getting very angry with the beast of burden that he's riding, the donkey or the ass that he's riding, and he starts beating it because he's not perceiving the real situation around him. He's not attuned to the divine realm, although the donkey is. And the wider context of the story also involves Balaam being ordered by a king to curse his enemies, and then Balaam doesn't do it. So it's really about blessing and cursing. And I believe that much of the time that we're cursing something, whether it's the traffic or a spilled cup of Starbucks or anything else, we're actually not cursing something external to ourselves. We're displaying our own divided self and our lack of integration with ourself, and we're really cursing ourself, or we're cursing that alienation from ourself. And in order to stop doing that, we have to become integrated instead of divided. It means, the word integrated, it means being like an integer instead of like a fraction. An integer is a whole number. It's not a fractionated number. So when you're integrated, you become like the number 1 instead of like the number 2 3/4 or some, fraction. All our anxiety and our depression and our self-sabotage, I would argue, comes from being fractionated, not being integrated. If we only had one set of clothes, then we wouldn't really have much anxiety about what to wear. Um, you know, we wouldn't have much anxiety over choosing what to wear. If all we had was one set of clothes, we would wear that set of clothes on all occasions. Well, that's what I mean by becoming integrated. If we become reconnected with who we really are, then we'll start to act out of that core authentic self at all times instead of being fractionated. We actually see Odysseus doing this in the Odyssey much of the time, acting kind of out of a core integrated self. Even though he's a master of disguise, he's a master of different situations, he often finds himself in all these different situations where the different situations call for different types of actions and behaviors, but he's acting out of a core integrated self most of the time. I'm absolutely convinced that the ancient myths are showing us how to reconnect with and become reintegrated with our authentic self. I can't teach you how to do it. I can only point you towards the myths, and I believe that the myths will point you towards the answer, towards yourself.